Hi, Bob. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I will say that when you invited me to do this presentation, I was a little bit, I guess, overwhelmed by the fact that this topic is literally changing every minute. It's not a topic that one can go out and research and then have all the answers. And it is a topic that is, I get asked a lot, what do you think is going to happen? What is the future of the office? How do we return to work? And my answer to these companies that we work with all the time is that it is the decisions that we're making every day, today, tomorrow, every day going forward, that are shaping that future. And so it's an incredibly dynamic, changing, and exciting time to be working in real estate and working in the prop tech industry, which is specifically my industry. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and to participate with everyone. One quick housekeeping detail is that I don't seem to be able to share my screen. So I think I just need to have the screen share enabled if you can.
Stand by one moment.
Thank you, Katie. These are the things that never happen when you're attending a live conference.
How about now?
Yes, now it is sharing. So here we go. Okay, Katie, can you just confirm that you can see my screen?
Looks great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So on this topic, back to the office and looking at flex and so many of the opportunities that exist today, it's a very serious topic. Companies are making these decisions or not making these decisions, as the case may be. And either way, it's worth an enormous amount of money for them and has a meaningful impact on the lives of their employees. And with the environment being so dynamic and changing every minute, these are really big decisions that they have to make. And I think it, obviously all of this started when we embarked on this global experiment. Sorry, I'm trying to see if I can go full screen, but I think that's as full screen as it gets. So yes, so there we go. So this started as a global experiment. We were all thrown into this at the same time. Nobody planned for a pandemic. Companies didn't plan for it. Communities, cities, states, nobody planned for this to happen. And we were thrown into it all at once. And there was no time for change management or all of the usual processes that are typically embarked upon when something of this magnitude is happening with a company, with their real estate, with how they operate, with their corporate culture. So, it's a moment in time where nobody is an expert in this. We're all learning as we go and becoming experts in this field and understanding and trying and pivoting. And as a tech company, it's been an interesting process to see these global corporations that my company StateBook works with kind of have to really learn to be agile and pivot and adopt a startup mentality in a lot of ways as they figure out how to navigate these waters. So let's look at what happened. Practically overnight, we had suddenly empty office spaces and everybody was ordered to work from home across the globe, essentially, at the same time, which had a very strong benefit because it leveled the playing field in a lot of ways. And as much as my corporate executive in the upper left-hand side there is overwhelmed and a bit panicked about how to manage suddenly a global workforce that was working from home, working remotely when not everything had been centered around the office for so long. It also was a very humanizing experience because all of a sudden, whether you were a salesperson or at any level of the company, suddenly you had a very interesting opportunity to access some of the corporate global leaders that perhaps you never would have otherwise, because the corporate structure was really set up where C-suite leadership is at the top, and there are a lot of gatekeepers that, rightly so, in a lot of ways, keep people away from leadership so that they can focus on the strategy and direction of the business. But with COVID, suddenly, if you were on a Zoom with one of your leaders, you were seeing the same issues with, the cat walking over the keyboard or the kids running around in the background that we all had. And so it was a very humanizing experience. And I also heard a lot of anecdotes from companies and employees, both management and employees, saying that they really appreciated the time that they were able to focus in this new environment with Zoom, because even if you only have a 15-minute meeting with someone, you have a very direct and intimate engagement with them. And so as much as this was a really scary thing, jumping into this with no experience, no planning, no foresight, it also had a lot of benefits to workers, to management, and I think in some ways to companies as a whole. Obviously, that is not the case across the board, and a lot of companies have really suffered and struggled. And most companies are still navigating their way through this and figuring out what their next steps are going to be. So in the very beginning, there were a lot of concerns with the fact that workers would suddenly be working at home, perhaps in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment with a bunch of kids and pets and spouses or partners that were also suddenly working from home and maybe didn't have a lot of bandwidth to focus on their jobs. And there was a lot of concern that worker productivity would take a dive. And it was also an interesting phenomenon that you saw something where Zoom went from something that you could do with a camera lens, right, zooming in on something, to a standard operating procedure where we were all in Zoom meetings all the time. Pre-COVID, as a tech startup, I was always having to explain to people that I was sending a Zoom calendar invite or a GoToMeeting invite, and nobody really knew what that was. And suddenly post-COVID or mid-COVID or wherever we are in this journey, Zoom went from the camera lens to something that everybody understood and was just ubiquitous. So that was a really interesting phenomenon to have happen. And then we had companies adopting all kinds of productivity tech, right? So there is tech that has evolved this prop tech marketplace, if you will. And I don't know if there's actually a name for sort of the workforce marketplace, but these apps have just proliferated. It's just been an extraordinary mountain of new tech being developed, new investment going into these spaces, right? So now we have tech to track productivity, to boost productivity, to communicate with each other virtually, to track the time of employees and make sure that they're focusing on the tasks that they need to focus on, to share files and collaborate with each other. And then some apps that like Monday.com and Mango are sort of trying to do it all and give you a one-stop shop where you can just have all of these different apps in one place. And then we have even Microsoft 365 for all of the companies that are using their tools. They developed a productivity score so that you could sort of monitor anonymously, of course, how engaged your employees are with the workforce tools that you're giving them, whether it's email or file sharing or whatever the Microsoft Teams and all of the different apps that they offer for productivity. And today, actually, 1 in 5 businesses now use tech that is capable of tracking their workers' online activity, because this has become such a huge issue. But what we found after this had been going on for months and months and months, remote work around the world, is that employees actually were more productive, not less productive, than they were working in the office. And if you look at the chart in the top right on the screen, you can see that red line is the percent of employees who are being productive in 2020, or their productivity, right, in 2020, versus the percent of employee productivity in 2019. So across the board, even when it took a dive, it was basically still higher than it was pre-COVID, pre-remote work. This was a huge surprise to a lot of companies. And what they found when they started surveying their workforce is that they appreciated the amount of commute time that was being saved in their day. They no longer had an hour and a half to a 2-hour commute. And so that was a lot more time saved. They didn't have lengthy in-person meetings anymore, because the majority of virtual meetings tend to be very time boxed. And they found overall they could get more done working from home and have a higher quality of life in many cases. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule. So if you're in New York City and you're in a 1-bedroom or studio apartment and you don't have the room to work or the ability to get outside during a pandemic to stretch your legs and feel safe and go get some time away from the screen, those are all exceptions, and those are extremely valid. And there has been a lot of study and work done around that Zoom fatigue. And what happened is we went from, as corporate leaders, we went from concerns about our employees being productive to creating all kinds of programs for them to help create a work-life balance and avoid that Zoom fatigue, because we are so in our zone once we get into that. And I know I personally tend to have 10, 12, 16 Zoom meetings a day, and very often forget to block time in between. And so my calendar just gets filled up, because of course I use the Calendly app, which allows people to just schedule remotely on my calendar. And so if I'm not careful and don't block out sections of time, I can get overwhelmed. So companies started doing all kinds of things to help their employees with that work-life balance. And what was really interesting is that despite that initial increase in productivity, productivity did fall, still I think above 2019 levels, but it did fall in the summer of last year. And you can see that big drop here. But by September, productivity began to pick up slightly. And as it was rising to 80% again in December of 2020 from its low in August, which also could be partly due to, surges in COVID, to summer vacations or staycations, since nobody was really traveling. But that sort of toxic productivity was what was really attributed to that big dip in productivity overall. And as employers started providing some of those different programs to their employees to help them achieve that work-life balance, perhaps that's responsible for that uptick that we started to see at the end of last year. But what was really interesting about a lot of the productivity data that was being monitored was that in surveys, employees, the unproductive employees that were answering these surveys about what could make the workplace better, they consistently responded hire leaders. And the study shows a lot of, and various studies show a lot of frustration around leaders who didn't know how to lead remotely, how to transition to an agile team, and so forth. And so I think that's something that companies have really started to pay attention to, and work toward and train their leaders on better. Some of those amenities that companies started offering to their employees to help create that corporate culture at home with remote teams were lunches being delivered remotely, which was a huge favorite among all employees surveyed that were receiving that. And remote yoga classes with your team, all kinds of remote team building opportunities. And also even some companies, many companies that we work with, mandated that their employees had to take Friday afternoons off, for example, because they knew that they were being so productive the rest of the week that they were just going to get burned out. And so they required them to take more time off, to have more free time, to have more flex time. So that was a really interesting outcome. And the employees who felt supported were happier and more productive, more loyal to the companies, less turnover. There were all kinds of benefits to the amenities that were being offered. Obviously, some amenities can go overboard, and that needs to be managed carefully. But we've seen a lot of really interesting and good feedback on this. To steal a line from my friend Kate North at Colliers, corporate culture is about how work gets done. So there's been a lot of talk among the companies that we talk to that are they're really concerned about how do we translate corporate culture to a remote team. And that line, corporate culture is about how work gets done, really resonates for me. And I think it's a very important piece to keep in mind as we go forward.
Hey, Calandra, we have a question that's relating to the context or where this information is coming from.
Yes, and I have all of the sources. They're small on the slides, but they are there. I don't think I can zoom in in this view, but I can get all of the sources at the end, and they are on each slide. So when you send out the slide deck, everybody will be able to see that.
Will you make these slides available to those that are interested?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Certainly. So as everybody knows, we've had a vaccine rollout, right? And so that's created a big question of, how do we get people back to work? What does the future of the office look like? What does that mean for our employees and for our company? And what is the time frame within which we will start to approach that? So what does return to office mean, right? So a lot of companies that we speak to continue to be in a holding pattern. They're not making any decisions until the end of year 2021. They're waiting to see what happens with variants. They're waiting to make decisions about space. You'll see in a few minutes when we start looking at some of the data, I have some slides on the dramatic office vacancy in New York City, for example, which is happening all over the country. But there are some groups that are theorizing that there is a lot more that will be coming down the pike as companies start to make those decisions and shed space, or do they bring people back to the office? I think it really remains to be seen. A lot of the companies that we're working with are still shedding space. They're allowing leases to expire. They are selling off space as a way to drive revenue to their bottom line. In some cases, companies are using COVID as an excuse to retire space, retire assets that they were going to do anyway. And now it sort of legitimizes their decision to do that. And so, I think there is a lot that remains to be seen, with the majority of companies that we speak with really in that holding pattern, not making any decisions until end of year 2021. That said, there are several companies out there that have already stated that they are adopting a flexible work mode, and that they will allow their employees to remain some, where it's possible to remain remote. Some companies are remaining entirely remote. And then some have already returned to the office or have set a date to return to the office. Or some of them are already back in the office. So here are just some of the companies on the left that have said, come back to the office. We want you back. We want you back now. As the CEO of Morgan Stanley said, it was either earlier this week or last week, I believe, if you can go to a restaurant in New York City, you can come into the office, and we want you in the office. So we're starting to see an uptick in restaurants and parks and people moving around in cities, but not returning to the office. So I think his point was actually kind of well made. However, there are companies like Apple who are saying, yes, please come back to the office. And they are requiring people to be back 3 days a week starting in September. So still some flex in there, but basically saying they are requiring people in the office 3 days a week. Pre-pandemic, I think it's interesting to note that really only 5% of US workers were fully remote. So that's an interesting statistic when you go from that to what we have. My company, StateBook, has developed some risk management platforms that enable companies to, and specifically we've been working with banks in partnership with Moody's Analytics to develop dashboards that are basically around looking at the data around an asset and explaining very clearly and easily to absorb what is happening in the economic market around that asset, and helping companies make decisions about what the value of the asset is, what the risk to the asset is, and so forth. So there are a lot of things that we can look at using demographic data that is very meaningful. And we can also look at the commercial potential of an asset, so that if companies are thinking about retiring assets out of their own portfolio, they know what the highest and best use of that asset is. And we do this with a whole wide variety of data inputs from the StateBook socioeconomic market data that we aggregate and collect. And then in partnership with mobility companies, we're able to map the foot traffic, in this case, coming to a location. So it's not just foot traffic, actually, it's anybody. So you can see here in this catchment area on the right, we're showing where people walk or drive from to get to a specific location. And the different densities of color show how many people are coming in from that location. So if we're looking at one of these squares, like this one in the top right, for example, where there's a high density of people that drive to get to this location, we can then look at the age, race, gender, income level, education level, what occupation those people have, what their average commute time to work is, all kinds of socioeconomic data about who those, well, what demographic characteristics those people have, not specifically who they are. And then we can look at the diversity of businesses in an area, and we can say this asset has highest and best use total commercial potential score for example, an office building would be this, and for a retail space would be that. And we can start to assign that total commercial potential to help companies understand what the highest and best use of their assets is, and what the value of those businesses is, and if they want to retire that asset now or hold on to it for the future. Other companies are going to embrace entirely the flexible work opportunity. And so this screen shows some very major companies that are really looking at the the future of work is flexibility, and they are committed to that. They believe that their employees want that. I think they're probably looking at the data that shows that there are a lot of employees that have moved, relocated over the pandemic, and we'll look at some data slides in a minute on that. But those people don't want to come back to the office. They have relocated during the pandemic to the suburbs or to a more remote rural area, or they've relocated back to where their family is. It's really caused a lot of people to reprioritize and to value their quality of life. It used to be just the millennials that were sort of famous for that, and now everybody has done that in one way or another. It doesn't mean that you've reprioritized, everyone has reprioritized away from the office. Certainly we are seeing some data that shows that there are a lot of people that do want to return to the office in some fashion because they miss the camaraderie, or they miss the opportunity to innovate at the water filter and so forth. So, but these are some of the leading companies that have really drawn that line in the sand and said, yes, we will allow our workforce in specific roles as appropriate, of course, but to remain flexible or remain remote to some capacity. As companies start to bring their workforce back globally, as we know, this is a global event. And so I think it's very important to look at it globally. And Google has migration data that they are publishing now that is freely available online to anybody that's interested in it. And they are showing, they're tracking where people are that have Google apps, right? So we know that they have you on the Google map and they know where you are at any given moment. And so they're tracking what people are doing and then anonymizing and reporting on that data. And so if you look here, just at the workplace activity in some cities is still about 50% below or more of pre-pandemic levels. So it's still dramatic. And you can see here in New York City public transit, the data on the right says that less than 40% of people, this is also Google data, 40% of people are using the trains, public transit, compared from, this is actually from the MTA, this data. They are using the public transit, subways and so forth in New York City. And you can see that it's well below pre-pandemic levels still at different locations throughout New York City. So people still are not taking public transportation to commute. And actually, we've heard, just to go back to that for 1 minute, we've heard some really interesting anecdotes about that from corporate executives who will not take public transportation anymore for fear of COVID, or because they simply don't want a 2-hour commute anymore, right? Or even housekeepers at hotels in New York City who are getting driven to work by friends who they're carpooling with and creating these sort of underground systems with in order to avoid public transportation, where normally, the majority of those types of workers would be absolutely taking public transportation as the most convenient and least expensive mode of transportation available. In Manhattan, just to look at the data for Manhattan specifically, 21.7% of employees are currently in the offices, right? So it's still down almost 80% vacancy from employees in the office. And there are various reports that have been coming out. 29% of employees are expected to return to the office by the end of July, based on different companies and large employers that are mandating it. And also, I think, driven largely by millennials who are anxious to return to the office in some cases, because they do miss the excitement and maybe free meals and collaboration, and also access to mentorship and some very meaningful and important upward mobility in their career trajectory. So all of those reasons are contributing to some of these numbers and projections. But the Partnership for New York City, which is, I believe, run by the mayor's office, is projecting 62% by the end of September. There is a lot of debate as to how accurate that projection might be. And some people are feeling it is very accurate, and some people are feeling that it is grandstanding on the side of the mayor's office, trying to encourage people to get back to work. So the truth, I'm sure, lies somewhere in between. What's interesting is on the employer side of the equation, 70% of employers surveyed in New York City are adopting a hybrid model. And 63% of those employers will require 3 days a week. So 63 of the 70%. And then 25% of employers in New York City will require full-time office. And 4% so far won't require workers in the office at all, so are going fully remote. Like I said, I believe that these numbers are very skewed based on the fact that a lot of companies have not yet made a decision as to what their return to office will look like, or at least haven't announced it. And I would say that is still the vast majority of employers, based on our experience. Manhattan office space, looking at the data, this is from Savills, there is a lot of office space still available. And this is looking, through pretty current data, and the amount of office space available is the highest since 2003. That said, if you look at these sort of trends, COVID, while it is the highest, it's not dramatically higher than what happened in 2003 and again in 2008, 2009. So it lends credence to the argument that people will, New York City will recover its vibrancy and its office capacity in some way. It may not be what we've always known it to be, but in some way the city will recover. 57% of office workers are currently working remotely, and 2 in 5 employees will still be working remotely at the end of the year, as reported by CNBC. This has had a dramatic effect on not just office space and employees, but also on all of the services and goods that are have sprung up throughout our cities, and specifically in Manhattan being one of our most vibrant cities. So as of January 2021, at least 1,000 restaurants in New York City have closed because there just is nobody there to go out for breakfast or coffee or lunch, corporate lunches, and just escape from the office lunches. Excuse me. There have been a lot of memes going around about how, I miss going to the office so much. I miss those rushed, choked down salads for lunch and and trivial conversation at the water cooler. But I think that it is actually very tragic what is happening to a lot of the small businesses that have been affected by this, and not just in big cities in Manhattan. Nationally, 1 in 3 small businesses are not expected to recover as a result of the pandemic. And so it has taken its toll in many, many ways by forcing remote work. And I think this is one of the reasons, of course, why mayors in New York City and elsewhere are really encouraging the economy to reopen. So if you look at US migration patterns, this is also Google data. So this is tracking from all of our cell phones. And what they are able to see is that retail and recreation is down 7%. Grocery and pharmacy is up 1%. There are some industries, of course, that haven't really taken the hit that small retail and hospitality and restaurants have taken, right? Parks up 61%. I think that's really interesting as people are starting to go outside more and it's safer outdoors, whether you're vaccinated or not. And you know, a lot of the data points to that. So people are recreating outdoors a lot more. Transit stations are down 8% for public transportation hubs. And workplaces are down 9% still from this is looking since May. So these are very recent statistics, not long-term statistics. And then about the same for mobility around residential. And this data I thought was really interesting. This is Placer AI, which is mobility data, again, tracked from cell phones, right? But this is looking at the state level migration change of year over year, where people have moved out of big cities, right? In this case, this is looking at states. How much population has the state lost? So you see New York, California, Illinois, right? Some of the biggest cities in the country. They make up, I believe, 70% of the total population. So when you're looking at this data, it's very heavily skewed to those large cities within those states, of course. And then it's very interesting to note that some of the places that people were moving to anyway for higher quality of life reasons, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, Colorado, Texas, those are the ones that continued to see and perhaps accelerate interest in moving to their states. So I think those are some really interesting trends to look at. And similarly, if you're looking at the migration patterns, this is also Placer data, looking at the metro areas, CBSAs or metro areas, you'll see similar kinds of trends where some of those large cities have really lost a lot of population. And this is looking April year over year change, in case you can't see the key there. Where some of the smaller cities that we would probably expect have been seeing, those second and third tier cities are seeing the majority of increase in migration. And I think one of the surprising ones was Tampa. So that was kind of a little bit of a surprise to me, but very interesting to see that those shifts over time. And then this is looking at Habitatum data, which is also similar to Placer AI, is a mobility company that anonymizes cell phone data and analyzes it. So this is a spider web showing where people moved from New York City to. And so these are all of the people migrating outside of New York City. In Habitatum's case, they are looking at anyone who they're considering a full-time move, for anybody who has been in another location other than their original home for more than 40 days. So they're considering that a move. So it's very interesting to look at this map and see where people are going to, at least sort of in our general region, US, Mexico, Canada. And then looking at, again, some of that Google data for New York City, you can see some of the local impacts on retail and recreation, grocery and pharmacy, parks up 98%, right? Which is very similar to that data that we saw in the national data. That was the correlating statistics for this. And then transit stations still down 21%, workplaces, and this is, you know, looking at the baseline of May, so May to today. So it's very current data and not long-term data. So it's not looking at pre-COVID numbers, just since May numbers. So as I said earlier, a lot of people are reprioritizing their quality of life, right? This is affecting workers everywhere. They've suddenly had a year and a half working from home. I spoke to several people, men and women, who have said that they never have been full-time home with their kids. And so it was a huge eye-opener for them to be just home with the kids full-time. many people got a COVID puppy or built a garden, or they have all kinds of anecdotes for what they consider higher quality of life, but it's just been a game changer for a lot of people. And as a result, they want more time with their family. They appreciate the level of productivity that they're able to achieve and still have that family time. They want shorter commutes. They may have already relocated and be in a completely different city to be closer to family or to have that higher quality of life or lower cost of living or whatever it is. And so that's driving a lot of people's decision about not to return to the office when that is their decision. And even several of the companies that we've spoken with have said that even senior management, they get a phone call saying, by the way, we relocated to another city. So in some cases, even the C-suite is doing this and asking forgiveness rather than permission. And so, companies that it's become a real quandary for a lot of global businesses to say, do we try to keep people local, or do we require that or allow that flexibility to work remotely? So this is going to continue to be an ongoing discussion for businesses. And the whole welcome back thing is not as simple as it might seem. So there are, conversations happening about how do we maintain our corporate culture if we stay remote? If we do bring people back, how do we maintain office safety and cleanliness? Do we require vaccinations? Is it even okay to do that, as some of the big banks have already started doing? You're not welcome back if you don't have proof of vaccination in some cases. Are we going to go full-time office, or are we going to go flex? Are we going to have collaborative spaces, or are we going to maintain that one-on-one office? Are we going to include amenities? Is it safe to serve lunch? What if there's a COVID outbreak and everybody's congregating in the cafeteria? Do we want that liability, or do we need to include those things because that's part of what gets people back in the office? And then what do we do if there are variants? How do we form a response plan for what if there is a flare up with variants, as we're starting to see in London and other places that had gone largely reopened, and now they're seeing big dramatic increases in certain variants, cases of certain variants, and so they're shutting back down in some places again. So what does that look like? And one of the biggest considerations is office safety and cleanliness. And a lot of the companies that I've spoken to have a lively debate about whether they are going to have more people coming in to clean at night, to make sure that offices are kept sterile and clean and safe for the people that do come back. Some companies are bringing more sanitation workers in during the day, even disrupting workflow and things like that, so that their employees can feel like they visually get to see that is happening, and they feel like it is safer, therefore, to be in the office. And coming back to an empty office isn't attractive, right? Nobody wants to come back to an empty office. And many of the companies that we're speaking to report that even though they are technically open for 25%, 50% of employees to return, only 10% of employees have returned to the office in many cases, because they come, they see that the office is empty, and then they turn around and don't come back because nobody wants to work in an empty office. And that's driving a lot of innovation in the reservation systems, because companies are finding that employees don't want to reserve a desk. They want to reserve space for their team, right? And so the reservation system companies both are proliferating, and they also are pivoting so that they can adapt to this need for having teams space reserved, as opposed to just a one-on-one desk. And what's interesting about that is some of the companies that we speak with have said that they are very cognizant, especially if they're global companies, that there's GDPR in Europe, for example, and that drives a lot of the plan that they have to have globally. So they have to enable employees to opt into specific pods so that they can come in with a team, and they can't say, okay, you're part of this team. You have to really literally opt in so that you can then reserve space with your team. And then fear of missing out is very real. Like, are the people that are in the office going to be promoted faster because they have more face time with the C-suite? Am I missing out with things if I'm the one that's remote and everybody else is in the office, or I'm one of several that are remote and everyone else is in the office? And how do I get that face time with upper management that will enable me to continue my own career trajectory, right? So these are just some of the considerations that these companies are having to make. I know several companies that are doing conference rooms where everybody has their own screen. So even if you're in the office or not in the office, you're still just one face on the screen. So there are the revolving cameras that just automatically pivot. So they're looking at whoever's speaking so that everybody that's on the screen and remote can see who is speaking and feel like they're in the room. So there are a lot of different options around this. But I think at the end of the day, this is an incredible opportunity to reimagine our space, to reimagine what it means to work, to reimagine how teams are led and how productivity is measured and how people are motivated to contribute to teams and be loyal to their companies, and what that corporate culture really means. And so there's endless amounts of considerations that we could continue to discuss here. But I think at the end of the day, that time to reimagine is really, really important, and what we need to focus on next. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today.
Calandra, that was great. Thank you very much. We do have a number of questions, and we're running a little bit short on time, but let me throw a couple of at you quickly. One, there was a question about the variants and how those variants are starting to emerge and become more than the original coronavirus, and if organizations are adapting to that, and then how do children play into that?
Yeah, so I am not an expert on coronavirus, I have to say. But there is a lot of really good data out there, and we actually have some of that data up on our Viral Insights platform, which is free and open to the public. So you can go to viralinsights.ai and see the current COVID statistics, and then some of the risk factors associated for every community. So that might be a good place to start. And then I think if you look at some of the sources of data that we're using there, you can start to piece together the answers to some of those questions. But I think that those are also very evolving conversations, right? As we watch the Delta variants and other variants coming in from Brazil or India or different places, and see how they take hold. And I think probably employers would say, and cities that we're working with all around the country, continue to wear masks where you can, continue to social distance, continue to, whether you're vaccinated or not, continue to monitor and make sure you're following best practices.
There was another question about, I guess, jobs and the shift in jobs and salary reductions. And, also there was an article in the Wall Street Journal about the number of people leaving jobs. So I wonder if you might shed some light on how all of that plays together.
Yeah, it is a huge debate that is going on. And I think that probably some of the panelists in the next session will touch on some of that. But at a very high level, because we only have a couple of minutes, the debate around salaries is something that we help companies track at StateBook. We help companies track that very actively. Because we have all of the data around each occupation and each wage rate and each industry and how much payroll is spent in that industry. And the debate revolves around if people are truly having this diaspora outside of the cities, right? And moving out to places that have a much lower cost of living. And they're doing that for quality of life reasons. Should companies continue to pay them the salary rate that is required to live in a big city? And so, of course, employees think yes, and employers think maybe no. And there is a very lively ongoing debate, but it is actually something I think that needs to be looked at in terms of the quality of work and deliverable that each employee is delivering and the value that they have to the company rather than where they live. So I think that debate is also very actively ongoing.
Great. I guess there was another question about people who don't have the privilege to work remotely and how the pandemic has, affected them.
It's dramatic. I mean, we know the data shows that there are a lot of people that are in those situations that, live in a small apartment in a big city, don't have those options to work remotely. There are obviously a lot of production workers or service positions that you have to be in person to perform, right? And so those people don't have a lot of the options that office workers have. So there are a lot of big issues around that I think cities in particular need to manage and be aware of, because those people can't be forgotten. And as we're reimagining those cities, to take into account how much upward mobility we're building toward for every strata of the socioeconomic realm, because you can't leave your people behind and only serve a certain portion of the population when you're making these changes to infrastructure or office or public transportation or availability of education and childcare that enables all of that upward trajectory.
Great. Well, Calandra, we're out of time. So thank you very much. There was a tremendous amount of information there, and that was all very helpful. For the questions that didn't get answered, we will be summarizing this into an article that goes into the magazine, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. I'd like to thank all of you for attending. We will be back at 1 o'clock with Ben Weber from Humanize, Kate Lister from Global Workplace Analytics, Peggy Roth from Leesman, and Brian Berthold from Cushman Wakefield, who will present the patterns and the trends that they're seeing, and then Calandra will moderate a conversation with them as well. So that's a separate link, so make sure you've clicked on the right link to get back in. And thank you for attending. We'll see you at 1 o'clock. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bob.